Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to look at today at the role of museums in remembering television. There are really two discrete things going on when museums address the history of television. On one hand, we have the general public who visit the museum on a casual basis. And on the other, we have those people who are the specialists, the academics, the historians, the broadcasters, the societies and the peer organizations, various other stakeholders with a more focused interest in heritage or in the subject area, which would, in our case, be television. A museum is a sort of garden of the muses. This is what the word means. The muses are the various faculties of the human mind extended out into the environment. They preside over the arts and sciences. So if you're wondering why we're part of the Science Museum group, this may be one reason. The 9 muses are daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory. So mental, spiritual, sensory, human faculties extended out into the environment. A museum is then, presumably, a collection of all of them in a kind of consciousness. And of course, this collective consciousness includes a sense of memory. Much like television, the museum has become a storehouse of human values, a cultural blood bank. And facilitating the casual visit is the core function of a modern museum. We are audience-focused. Grant and aid funding is tied directly to our visitor numbers. It's much like television. The casual visitors, or commercial television anyway, the casual visitors should be offered an experience which is accessible to them and inspiring should they wish to become specialists in the future. It should be an experience which they will remember. There are endless possible contributions to the museum's core offer, which can be made from the academic sector and broadcast industry and other stakeholders. And similarly, there are contributions which can be made from the background knowledge about the collections themselves. And this is the second main function of the museum, to preserve historical knowledge through objects for current and future generations. And so how will the next generation feel about the decisions we're making today as regards to what we decide to preserve and what we decide to remember and research, as far as information goes as well? For the Media Museum, we address photography, film, and television. Photography is a chemical revolution, finding ways to collect and store still images chemically. And there are, in fact, over 170 photographic processes that exist. We have most of them in our collection here. The mechanical revolution is the film. It's the merger of the photograph and the reel. And television is an electronic revolution carried forward from radio. The thing that they really all have in common is that they all concern images. Revolution is basically the same, whether defined by Marx or the I Ching, removal of the antiquated. So into this museum environment, often reserved for antiquity, we are trying to place artifacts which are associated with antiquity's removal. Revolution replaces one status quo with another. Video artists such as David Hall are expert at using television in a contemporary gallery context. However, I have yet to see many historical broadcast television exhibitions which really exploit the museum as a medium. Is it that television subject matter, whether objects or programs, does not fit into a traditional museum or gallery context? And this is something I discovered a few years ago, soon after arriving. And we have a lot of information on this, actually. The Science Museum photographer went in 1937 and documented it, and we have the floor plan. It's the London Science Museum's television exhibition of 1937, and it was held in the summer. It had 250,000 visitors. It was really the first serious exhibition of television in Britain. And 30 years later, at a seminar given at the Museum of the City of New York, Marcia McLuhan referred to that museum feeling. And it's not a positive feeling, unfortunately. He described it as a kind of claustrophobia and exhaustion which settles upon you as soon as you get inside those straightened avenues and alleyways. Once you move into a world of continuous connected space, visual space, you quickly discover exhaustion setting in because there is no means of participation. And I think this is an example of the type of exhibition he's thinking about. And it was good to find one that actually addresses television rather than a generic one. But there is a 1932 photograph of the Science Museum, and it is literally nothing but those two cases in the top photo, just about 100 of those on about 4 different levels in the main entrance to the Science Museum, and labels probably in Latin as well. So museums have come a long way. If you want audience participation, you get rid of lineal connected space. However, most curators today still work in the lineal tradition, writing up an interpretation strategy and content hierarchy and adding objects to illustrate it, rather than starting with the objects and the stories they tell and building environments to suit them. Exhibitions about television have historically been dominated by visual narratives, essentially linear representations of objects, or a chronological video sequence representing the programs of different types or eras, matter-of-fact explanatory panels. Such exhibitions are, at their essence, a book on the wall. Take photographs of all of the objects, put them in printed form, and you will have a book. Is it a museum? The whole concept is a written one. Linear arrangement makes it difficult for audiences to associate the content of the exhibition with the ways it was actually experienced in the past. So one way around this, why not create environments which exploit opportunities for nostalgia, those which document changes in the nature of the television experience and demonstrate how the human condition has been changed by it? Nostalgia, of course, is usually positive, and sometimes, by definition, it's positive, so sometimes our memories are not necessarily going to be of positive things. So nostalgia really is only part of it as well. With the Renaissance in the West and the Ming Dynasty in the East, the printing press brought with it a visual bias, which McLuhan and others have argued was overturned with the arrival of electronic communication, starting with the telegraph. This was about 1840. This effect increased with the arrival of each new electronic medium, radio, telephone, television. We return to a more unified sensorium now in the electronic age. What was discovered in the 1960 seminar in New York was that museums were too regimented to a single print-biased point of view. This is regardless of whether the exhibitions have been put together by a team. They were saying that museums in general were not tribal enough. They were too continuous and connected. The visual man is always looking for connection. I don't follow you. This is the autograph of the visual man, said McLuhan. In an exercise to determine the National Media Museum's values, which I participated in a few weeks ago, continuity was still seen as desirable. In addition to that, I found so much in the 1967 seminar proceedings which are still relevant today as they were then. So many of their concerns are totally applicable to today's museum exhibitions. There is no doubt that museums have changed a great deal over the 4+ decades since, but not in many ways. Are TV museums functioning in an environment like Pascal's theater of the absurd, lost between print and electric worlds, which never seem to get any closer together? McLuhan observed that Hieronymus Bosch had one foot in medieval space and one in Renaissance space, and the meeting of the two represented to Bosch pure nightmare. The world of absolute nightmare was the meeting of the medieval and the Renaissance. There is a reaction against everything that has just been started. People kick against what they have just outgrown. As barriers have disappeared with digital, various barriers to producing content and receiving and recording have disappeared with digital technology, efforts to preserve some of the analog technology of the past 20 years is thus going through a rough patch. It has been difficult, for example, to justify the acquisition of transmitter artifacts relating to the analog shutdown at the time when the window for collecting them is at its zenith. Is it the best time to collect something before it is forgotten? The joy of discovering forgotten history often creates excitement in an acquisitions meeting and causes us to make an acquisition. The environment of the object has obviously changed. Many people have difficulty understanding, argued McLuhan, that the television screen is not a visual form at all, but a world of profiles that are very tactile and very flat. He referred to James Joyce's phrase where he called the television screen the charge of the light barricade. The image comes at the viewer. The viewer does not look at the screen in television. He is the screen. In movies, you are the camera and you look at the screen. That theme of touch is inherent now in practically everyone raised in the television environment. Having been X-rayed by the TV image from early childhood, we now feel the need to handle things in depth. We want to be engaged in subjects and with objects. The old pictorial detached look at things will not serve. But another peculiarity about touch is this. Granted that there is the natural human desire to touch, the fact that touch creates an interval involves the audience very much more. The interval has to be closed. When you create an interval, you have to close it, and it is the closing of the interval that creates participation in rhythm. Music is the space between the notes, said the French composer Claude Debussy. Comedians say that timing is everything, but by timing, they almost always mean the pause. The pause is not merely a void between the things that matter. Magic stays where myth remains, sings Sophie Ellis-Bextor. McLuhan wrote that action is in the interval. The action is in the interval, which is one of his sayings similar to the medium is the message. What is happening in the interval in the electronic age tends to follow the laws of resonance. Okay. I'm having trouble. Shouldn't have done the dishes last night. The suddenness of the insight, or the suddenness of discovery, the moment of truth, the eureka moment, is closely related to touch and the interval created by touch. To the blind, all things are sudden, said McLuhan. Do any of us really know what is coming next on our TV screen? We're deeply in an electronic age, and young people who are coming to museums will, like a television viewer, expect a multisensory involvement in the exhibitions. The absence of storyline is something that certainly concerns a museum. In order to create involvement, you have to take out storyline and perspective, stress process. This is the great discovery of Edgar Allan Poe. In his poetry and stories, he discovered that if he pulled out some of the connections, he could get much higher involvement. The reader becomes a co-producer or a co-creator. And this is also true of Sherlock Holmes and Doctor Who. Why not leave gaps for what the audience already knows about TV? The audience brings considerable knowledge with them. They watch a lot of TV. The tendency in the TV museum is often to confirm the existing consciousness rather than to expand it. Art is the language through which we perceive new relationships at work and in the environment, both physical and metaphysical. Art is the essential instrument in the very development of that consciousness. Why is there such a desire to tell visitors what they already know? The Balinese say, we have no art, we do everything as well as possible. The recent fashion in museums is towards multimedia treasures galleries. Rather than one subject or medium being discovered in depth, such as television, the gallery will cover several categories of object, presumably creating a more disconnected, involving space. The diverse selection is actually very much in keeping with McLuhan saying that objects are unobservable, only relationships amongst objects are observable. Another separation that's quite interesting, the information separate from object has become true in our born digital age, where things we wish to remember can have no tangible or physical component. This is something which museums are struggling to come to terms with. The information itself can be stored and reproduced in a variety of physical forms and physical environments. Forget waiting for the 3D printing to get better. In our age of technology, it is already extremely easy to reproduce things. One of the things we don't notice about artifacts is that they create environments. The motor car creates a special environment. The radio environment is quite different from that of television. The most memorable artifacts made by man are environment, not objects that are contained in that environment. And paradoxically, they are invisible. For some biological, physiological reason, people don't see the environment. They tend to see the content of the environment. The environment created by the artifact is the one from which it came. In this sense, museums have helped in the recreation of the original environmental processes which produced the artifact. This is regular practice in natural history museums as well, but rare for television museums, and I wonder why this is. At the 1967 seminar, the Royal Ontario Museum curator Harley Parker said, I think museums can begin to think non-linearly. They can begin to reshape the Renaissance house, which they had lived in for 150 years, which will be 200 years now, and begin to make it possible for the object to come with its own environment, with its own ambience. I think it's very important that we begin to think in these terms. that we give the new world a chance to become involved, the new television audience, that we think about eliminating the storyline, the didactic Cook's tour that we take everybody on. And Cook's tour would be referring to Thomas Cook. It was Aristotle who pointed out that way back in the period when they were just discovering visual space and values, that any form, any kind of organized form, when pushed to its limits, instantly assumes the opposite characteristics. And we have seen this happen in our own time. McLuhan has a book called Culture Has Become Our Business. Ours used to be a business civilization with very little culture added. Now, in the age when the knowledge industries have become overwhelmingly dominant, culture has become the primary mark of our age. It was announced last month by the DCMS that Britain's television and creative industries are worth £71.4 billion per year to the economy, and in 2012 accounted for 1.68 million jobs, which is 5.6% of all UK jobs. The intermedia network has made all of us artists by proxy. A decade of television watching is equal to a comprehensive course in dramatic acting, writing, and filming. Compressed in such constant and massive dosage, we begin to see the methods and cliches more clearly. Some of the mystique is gone. We could almost do it ourselves. A recent survey by TV Licensing has shown that adults in Britain watch over 30 hours of television per week on average. McLuhan has noted that the true significance of Pavlov's experiments was that any controlled man-made environment is a conditioner that creates non-perceptive somnambulists. And I think this is true of the jobs that people have, that they don't necessarily see the job that they're working at themselves. It's easier to see it from outside. It's the idea that man is conditioned by his environment, and that the environment for contemporary man is the intermedia network. We are conditioned more by cinema and television than by nature. It is the detachment provided by print media which belongs to the specialists, the academics, the historians, the societies, and the peer organizations. McLuhan was remembered for observing that as people become more involved, they know less and less. Television museums need the book, the journal, the catalog, the database, the blog, for developing and sharing our collections. It is the forum for original work and the language for making academic partnerships work with museums. The suddenness of the insight, or the suddenness of discovery, the moment of truth, the eureka moment, is closely related to touch and the interval created by touch. To the blind, all things are sudden. Do any of us really know what is coming next on our TV screen? I think I'm going backwards here. Sorry. There is new AHRC and other funding, which is only available in partnership with museums. It promises to create a whole new generation of scholars linked to museums, and breaks the pattern of students necessarily continuing their supervisor's work. By putting objects at the core of what we do, it leads to unique memories being retrieved, which can greatly complement the other forms of research. Television crosses all subject boundaries. This academic PhD research should expect to start with museum concerns. Museum collections identify their own paths towards new areas of exploration, but the priorities for the museums are not necessarily obvious to academics. Academics need to retune to think about the environments that objects create, and how these environments are remembered, and how they can be retrieved, modeled, or emulated. Television technologies have created new regional, national, and global environments for distributing audiovisual content, such as microwave links with Eurovision, communication satellites, and now, more recently, the internet. Academics need partnerships to show how their work changes the world. It shows taxpayers' money is not wasted. Few media have changed the world as much as television. In fact, it is often argued that television, having created the global village we all reside in today, is the most important invention of the 20th century. Thank you.